This is the Atari 8-bit podcast.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. George Morrison was founder of Alpha Systems, a company that produced many hardware and software products for the Atari computers, including the Parrot, an audio digitizer, MagniPrint, a printing utility, the Impersonator, hardware for copying cartridge-based programs, and other products. He was the author of 2 books, Atari Software Protection Techniques and Advanced Atari Protection Techniques, both of which were published by his company, Alpha Systems. This interview took place on October 16, 2018. In it, we discuss Ed Stewart and Richard Leinecker, both of whom I have previously interviewed.
I was going to Kent State University in the 1970s and late 1970s, and I went to my first accounting class, and not accounting class, but I went to a class on computers, and I was an accounting major, and basically they said, if you're an accounting major, you should not be in this class. You should instead be in the Fortran class, which is all card-based and all that. And being too embarrassed to get up in front of all the other people and, leave the auditorium, I stuck around, and the guy was saying all this great stuff about, in a few years when you graduate, there's going to be a huge demand for people in computer science. So I said, wow, that sounds great. And I was always really interested in it, always a huge fan of sci-fi and computers and things like that. So it made total sense. I didn't even really realize at that point that there was a career in that. So amazingly, fortunately, I stuck around in that class and I took the class. And that was on old-fashioned like teletype terminal. But later I did take the Fortran class that was required for accounting majors. And had I started there, that was a card-based system. And it was incredibly painful in those days. So you'd print out your cards. And, of course, I was a bad typist, so I'd mess things up. And it'd take about 2 hours turnaround to get your printout back from your card deck. So had I started there, I probably never would have went into the computer science. But so by amazing luck, I wound up in computer science at Kent State. And so I graduated there, and they were not lying. We had, I believe, something like 12 people graduating in computer science, and we had 175 companies coming wanting to interview us. So, and we were very selective, of course, on who we went to work for. But being a local guy here in Cleveland area, I ended up, and basically too, by the time I got an offer from this company, I'd already had so many offers that I, had upped the price, and they were willing to basically give me a very good amount, a good salary. So I started at BF Goodrich in 1980 or so. And that was right around the time, Ataris came out, I believe, in 79, the Atari 800 and 400. And they already had a little Atari computer club there. So, of course, I joined that immediately. And, I wasn't too sure at that time. I was looking at the TI 99.4. I was looking, at the, even before that, I was so into it. During my studies, I would go to Radio Shack and just type in on the little computers there, like type in little games and stuff, because I couldn't afford to buy a computer. But now that I had a job, I could afford it. So I got, and people told me, don't even mess with the cassette, go right to the disc. So that was very good advice too. So I ended up buying an Atari 800, 48K with I believe it was the 850 disk drive. And I was very, very happy with it. And gave up most of my other passions at that time and just played with that computer for like hours every evening coming home.
So what were you doing with it?
I was writing games. I was playing games. I was just everything you can think of, learning it. Even though I was a professional programmer at the time, I was a professional programmer in COBOL, on a giant mainframe computer that had card reader, So as you can imagine, that's night and day difference from, an Atari 800. And, especially, like I say, I had a nice setup with it. And in our little club there, we had been like, we had figured out how to copy games and share them with each other and things like that. I can say that today that, obviously there was a lot of kind of piracy, I guess you'd call it back then, so that's how I got started. And I remember I wrote several little games, just for fun. I typed in stuff from magazines at the time. I believe I think Analog might have come out first, and there was Compute and a few other magazines, Antic and Analog and Compute. And but in the very early days there, in like 1980 or so, you had a few software companies putting things out, and I played those games. Atari Program Exchange was around, and I basically started writing my own little games. Using the little assembler subroutines and stuff like that, just for my own entertainment. And I went to a local user group meeting at a computer store near me, and I showed my games just to show them to other people and share it, and gave people copies. And two people approached me afterwards and said, "Hey, why don't we sell your games? We have a little company, and we just sell to local stores here, but we can do that." So a company named Rampage. And so I put some stuff together with them. I worked with them to make a little game package. That was something called Spacewalk Arcade, which was really the first commercial piece of software I wrote. And they were selling it to a few local stores here and there. And around that same time, this is probably into 81 now, maybe late in 81, a game came out that you couldn't copy. It had, even a sector copy couldn't copy it. It had bad sectors on it. So, and that really got me started more into that, and I didn't really think too much of it. Just, you can't copy that game. It's got a bad sector. No one knows how to create a bad sector without a specialized equipment or something. But one of my friends tried to give me a copy of something, and I tried to copy it, and I couldn't. And, I'm like, "What's wrong with your disk?" And he goes, "Well, it runs fine on my machine." And so then I hear his disk loading, and it's going like super fast. And I go, why is that going so much faster than mine? He goes, "Oh, there's a little speed knob inside the disk drive. I turned it all the way up, and it runs way faster." I go, "Yeah, it probably works good on yours, but for some reason on my drive, I can't read that at all." That gave me the idea. I wonder if messing with the speed, I could create a bad sector, basically, and be able to back up games. And so I did that. And that let me create a bad sector, and I was able to back up a game that was protected that way. And I was very impressed with myself and happy. But, I didn't really share it with anybody or tell anybody. It was just kind of my own little invention now. And then later at another user group meeting, still selling my stuff through Rampage, but going to some, local user groups. And somebody saying, "Yeah, the newest games, you can't back them up anymore because of the bad sectors." And I remember just kind of offhandedly commenting, "Well, actually, there is a way to create those if you wanted to." But, and then, I didn't say anything. And, because especially at the store there, they wouldn't like us talking about that at the store.
Sure.
So I left the thing. And later that night, I get a call. And it's a guy that I had met at the club. And he's going like, "You got to tell me how to make that bad sector." And I go, "No, I don't think that'd be good to really share that info, Then he's like, I'll pay you $25. And I'm like, "Well, now you got my interest, but still, I don't know. If I give it to you, then you'll tell everybody else." And, so he ends up going away, calling me back within a half hour. And he goes, "Hey, I got 5 other people from the club. They're all willing to pitch in $25. So that's like $250. Will you do it for that?" And I'm going, wow, I didn't realize there's such a market for making bad sectors. And so I went ahead and I put together a little program that would copy stuff. And basically, the trick was at that point, if you wanted to copy a bad sector, The trick was that you had to make a sector copier, so copy the whole disk by sector, and then go in on where the bad sector was. I wrote a little program that you type in the sector you wanted to write. I had done this just for my own use, and you'd slow down your disk drive to very slow and write the sector. And then when later you tried to, run the disk at normal speed, it would get the bad sector, and the game would run. And so anyway, so I did that, and then I'm like going, I guess there's a market for this, And I went to the guys at the Rampage company, and I said, if I was going to come out with this, though, I'd want to advertise it, not just go to, they were selling stuff. I probably sold like 10 copies total of my game, at the, because they were only selling it at maybe 4 or 5 local stores. When I say local, within probably like 50-mile area, And they were like, no, not really interested in getting into advertising and all that kind of stuff. So I remember just kind of like separating from them and saying, all right, maybe I'll just do something on my own. And I came out with my first ad in Analog Magazine, a quarter page. I actually sent you a copy of it. I don't know if you saw that note.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, a really old one that just had the... Oh, and at the time, I was worried about saying pirate software using this program, even though there actually was another program that had claimed to be able to do it, but actually couldn't. Turned out to be more like a scam type of thing. But I decided to go a different route. I said, why don't I just make a book on software protection techniques? Then nobody will have a problem with me. I tell you how to create bad sectors and stuff. I do give you a sector copier and all that. So I let you do it, but I'm also teaching you. You learn with the book. The disk has all kinds of other stuff, like how to encrypt things, how to do other factors. And I just thought that would make it an interesting thing, all around. And I bundled it with a different pack of games that I had wrote. And also a utility pack just called Disk Pack 1000. So I'd written over the years my own little utility pack where I had things that would do things with disk drives and, color calibration and various things like that. And I put that together too. So I sold basically the Disk Pack 1000, it was called. And then the Atari Software Protection Techniques was my first book. And I remember running the ad. I hadn't actually written the book. So I had the idea for the book. I wrote an outline. And I said, well, it's going to cost me $190 to run this ad. My brother actually did the graphics for it. And I don't know if anybody's going to buy this thing. Oh, yeah, you got a copy. Yeah, and I said, I don't know that anybody's really going to buy this. So I'm not going to bother doing anything until after I see if anybody buys it. If somebody buys it, then I'm going to finish this book up. I had, chapter outlines and all that. And placed the ad in Analog Magazine, like I say, quarter page. This is in 81 at some point, I believe. And I got an answering service to answer the calls. And I remember I hadn't gotten my Analog Magazine yet, but, it was due in another day or so. And I was really excited, I can't wait to see my ad. And I get a call from the answering service. They go, what are you doing? Are you coming down to get your orders? And I go, what? And they go, oh, yeah, the magazine must have come out in some areas. Some people must have got it a day quicker than me. We started about 8 o'clock this morning, and we have about 250 orders here so far. And I'm like, oh, my God. So they're like, you better get down here and pick up your orders. I'm like, all right. So I came down, picked up the orders, and I couldn't believe it. So I had all these people's charge card numbers and everything. And I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I haven't finished the book yet, So I really got cracking on the book. I sent out a postcard. By the time I sent out the postcard, it took me about a month and stuff to get things together. And I sent out a postcard like announcing, like in a month, I'll ship the product to all these people. And I say, if you want to cancel, feel free. Just, return something or call the support number and, we'll cancel your order if you don't want to wait. But otherwise, I'll be shipping in, like a month's time from then. So that gave me another like 2 months to get it all together. And the book you see is what they got, along with a disc of software that had things like, as I say, like a sector copier and a number of other things that you could do. And that turned out to be a big, big hit. At the time, I was making pretty good money working for Goodrich, but, I was starting to make more money from doing software. So I came out with more stuff that I wrote myself. And later, other people local to my area had software, and they're like, I wonder if you could sell something like this. And usually it'd take a lot of work to work with some hobbyist who had an idea and work with them and turn that into an actual product and create documentation for it and all the other things. And I remember, I think the second product or so I came out with was something called MagniPrint, which was another friend of mine who was just a pure hobbyist. I actually found, even though I was a professional programmer, most of the time the professional programmers weren't really breaking a lot of ground in most cases. There were a few who were, but the hobbyists were the people really creating some great stuff. And so that's how I got started in Alpha Systems. As I say, I first came out with my own book and disc packs, and then started adding other products. Some of those I wrote myself. Some I partnered with somebody else, or they wrote the initial thing and I worked with them on it to bring it up to market. And yeah.
All right. Where did the name Alpha Systems come from?
I remember it was originally going to be Software Corporation of Earth. And that was my original name for the company when I came up with the idea. And people told me, no, you want something that sounds a little more like official sounding, And so then I originally said, okay, how about something like Alpha Software? And then I thought, no, maybe I want to sell hardware add-ons at some point. So I'll make it more generic and call it Alpha Systems. So basically, sure. It was my attempt at coming out with a more professional name than I normally would have done. I would have come up with more of a comedy type name,
Mm-hmm. So my copy of Advanced Software Protection Techniques
yes.
Came with a letter that makes me, I didn't understand the context before, but it makes me think you ran that same scam a second time, because it says, it's brilliant. I'm not discouraging you. It says, thank you for ordering Advanced Protection Techniques, Book 2. As you know, the special set has not been released yet. This letter is your confirmation that you're on our list of preferred customers. So it sounds to me like maybe you were selling this book before you wrote this book, too.
Yes, I was. My problem was, over-promising. So in other words, I knew that there was this lag between the time that the ad would come out, the time I'd write an ad, and the time that the ad would come out. And even though I came out with the first book, on the second book, I also underestimated how long it would take. Now, the thing that you have to understand, though, about the Atari market at that time, did you have an 8-bit computer, Atari, in like 1980 and 1981, for example? Yeah. Well, about every piece of software that was coming out, among the enthusiasts, there were people who were, like any news about a new piece of software, we were excited. We wanted to see it. We were willing to put up with that kind of terrible customer service, at that point in time. And, I was saying to you how we allowed people to cancel. I think I've got basically zero cancellations ever, even though I was delayed for the first book, I believe, for 2 months, and for the second book, at least a month, I believe, And the second book, I had a bigger head start on because I'd already, I thought I'd be finished by the time the ad ran, and I wasn't. Sorry about that. That's I'm going off at the background there.
I can barely hear it. It's all right.
Oh, okay.
Did you keep your job at Goodrich this whole time, or did you quit your job? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I kept my job at Goodrich. And in fact, as the company was growing, and I remember a year or two, I actually made 5x times off this company. I had an accountant, and he's going like, why do you work at this job that's paying you like 1/10 of your revenue? It was an amazing amount of revenue I was actually bringing in at that point in time. By that time I had left Goodrich. I was at Firestone. And at one point they were having some layoffs at Firestone. At Firestone. And the deal was, it was a pretty amazing deal back in those days. A lot of these companies back in the 80s, as you know, were very much like if you took a job there, you were expected to be there for life, and they took good care of you. So when they were having these layoffs, and that was also a union shop too, although I wasn't in the union since I was just a developer. But they basically, you'd get over 6 months' pay if you got laid off. And I remember a guy underneath me at the company was getting laid off. And they had a policy where if I was getting laid off, I could bump him and he would get laid off instead because I was ahead of him in seniority. So I could bump somebody else and he would get laid off instead of me. So I tried, to say, I want to be laid off, get my 6 months pay, and I'll go full time in Alpha Systems. I'll really go, whole hog into this. And basically they said, no, that's what we call a reverse bump, and that's not allowed, So, and we need you. We're not letting you go. So I stayed. And during the entire time of Alpha Systems, and keep in mind, Alpha Systems wasn't just 8-bit Ataris. Later, we got into STs, and we did other stuff even on the PCs further out. We talked about doing stuff for Commodores and other computers as well, but I never actually did that. I was committed Atari man, even though, when the 16-bit came out, of course, if you were a dedicated 8-bit Atari guy, you were really looking at the Amiga because that was kind of the child of the Atari 800, while the ST was more the child of the Commodore 64. Basically, the two companies switched 16-bit computers because of Jack Tramiel and all that. So I won't go into that. That's a separate story.
So can you give me an estimate of how many copies of your books you might have sold?
I don't remember, but I know that the books, at least the first book went through 6 printings. Now, keep in mind, the first printing or two, as I said, I didn't know how many I was going to sell, although I had enough orders to fulfill. Believe it, before I even came out with the book, before the book was printed, I had about 220 orders. And at the time, I just got a girl to help me, do all this because I was, I was working on programming and I didn't want to have to fill orders and things like that. So I hired a girl to help out. And she's going like, the day you come out with this book, you make like 50 grand in profit, because essentially I was selling the book, I believe, for something like $19.99 or something like that. And the book itself, I self-published, which meant that I had the pages printed at one place. I had a guy who did lithography, do the cover, and my brother did the art for it. And basically, was able to put the book together for about $1.50 to $2. I had about another $1 in the disc if you bought the disc pack for $24.95, I believe it was. And so basically, that was a pretty high profit margin on that book. Of course, I had the intellectual property, let's call it, going into it. But still, it was quite a high profit margin selling direct right out of my home, as it was, my apartment at that time. And she was telling me. And so I believe in some of my peak years, I was making this was when Alpha Systems was bigger then, but I probably made about $750,000 in 1 year, in revenue. And, but most of that was profit, so these products had a high profit margin in that era, And I had many years like that. So it was a profitable business, and a fun business. I did it 90% for fun, 10% for profit. So.
Nice.
Yeah.
And so how'd you get the other, I don't know, knowledge about, just looking through the books here, like, cartridge protection techniques, and I mean, were you just messing with the stuff yourself to learn these things?
Yeah,
or?
the majority of it's like that. If you look in there, you'll see, depending on if you're looking at the first book or the second book, you'll see like cassette protection. That I actually worked with another guy, and he gave him a royalty on each book I sold, small royalty, for helping me on the cassette side, because I never really was into the cassette so much, and he had figured out all the different tricks on the cassette. We actually sold a product called Cassette Operating System too. That was a thing that could back up cassettes and create multi-part cassettes and, do various tricks with the cassette recorder. And so I, some of that came from that. A lot of the knowledge I got from, I had read, one of the things that was so great about the Atari, and this was what really made me go that direction. I was saying how I looked at the TI-99 and, of course, the TRS-80 and, of course, the Apple, was that Atari, one of the things when I got into it in 1980, they had already released the book De Re Atari, which was basically the annotated operating system for this thing. And when you looked at something like the TI-99/4, there was really no information about it. It was a black hole, but yet with the Atari Program Exchange, they had a conference where I didn't go to it, but one of my friends did, where they had all kinds of unbelievable information about the internals of each of the chips in the Atari, how to program them. As you know, being from that history, that was a really exciting computer in its day. It was really not only like the best hardware, but really was the most open and accessible system out there as well, where you could basically experiment with hardware and software. And I really was excited by that. And so I learned a lot by looking at the operating system, reading that, talking to other people. The cartridges I had was one of the first things I had figured out was how to back up cartridges, because there was all those games that Atari came out with. And to be able to share those with our club, we wanted to be able to do that without everybody buying separate copies. So me and another guy basically had figured out that underneath a cartridge is, you could basically read it. If you slammed in the cartridge, even though you weren't supposed to do that while the machine was running, you could do it. And you just had to keep the little door on the 800 at least propped open with something. And you'd slam in the cartridge and you could actually read it out and later just put it back to where it remained. Of course, one of the things that happened, let's say not too long after that, was all of a sudden a cartridge came out where you attempted to do that. You'd read it and you'd write it back to the same area of RAM that was right underneath the cartridge, and you'd try to run it and you'd see that it would crash. And they'd be like, how's it knowing that it's not running off the cartridge? And I remember thinking to myself and playing around and debugging some of the code. I had also written a disassembler by that time, too. So I could disassemble the code and I could easily see what they were doing. Basically, they were writing to an area of the RAM and seeing if they were able to write to it. Then they said, crash the program. If they weren't able to write to it, that meant it was really a cartridge, because once you had the cartridge in there, you couldn't write to it anymore. And so that led to the creation of one of our products called the Impersonator, which I had the most inexpensive cartridge backup system around. It could do everything except later, after the Impersonator came out, they came out with Miner 2049 that had the bank switching. And of course, it couldn't do that. But it could copy all other cartridges at the time.
So how did the Impersonator work?
Well, the Impersonator was similar. There was another product that came out around the same time as the Impersonator called the Pill. They actually did something a little nicer than what I did. So they actually had a switch on theirs. So basically, you'd plug in the cartridge. So it would make the computer think that there's a cartridge in there. But you had to plug it in after the computer was already running. So you already had that in there. Now, by plugging in the special cartridge that basically, in my case, it just had a single chip on it. So it was very inexpensive to make. You'd slam that cartridge in there, and it would basically lock it out, so it would no longer be able to write to that area of RAM. So now, after I came out with mine, like I say, this thing called the Pill came out, which did the same thing, except they had a switch, which was, I admit, nicer, so that you could have the cartridge in there from before you started the computer, less risky, let's say. Putting a cartridge in when it's running, there was a small risk factor that, even though the cartridge slot was tight enough so that the odds of you crossing to like a power with something else, let's say, and frying out your computer was small, it was still there. It's still potentially possible to do it. I don't know anybody who ever did that. And I especially with mine, I made sure that it fit very tight so that you wouldn't be able to twist it or anything. But still, so there was actually another product that came out that did the same thing shortly thereafter, or around the same time, I believe. So yeah, that was the Impersonator. Of course, our most popular stuff, we did have this MagniPrint, and MagniPrint, that was something that allowed you to take your pictures from the computer and print them and create a giant poster, of your graphics, for example, and we'd show those at shows. Basically, it was continuous paper back then. So you just print continuously, and then you'd have strip 1, then you'd have strip 2, strip 3. And depending on the resolution, we'd create dot patterns that would represent those different shades, especially the GITA chip, the GTIA chip could do the 16 shades of gray. So those tended to print really, really nicely, And so we had a lot of that kind of thing, and that printed. Later, we came out with a partnering deal that we did with the company Computerize, that they had the digitization. So they would allow you to digitize the video, not video, but, basically we take a picture.
Still images from video, right.
And then you could use that. And with MagniPrint, for example, you could lower the resolution down and create like Photoshop icons of your own pictures created with Computerize, and so we really had a nice package going there. And even our whole package was selling for cheaper because we had a partnership with Computerize. We were actually able to sell the whole package with MagniPrint cheaper than they were selling just Computerize for it at retail price. So we were actually selling at a discount, which later, about a year or two in, got us in some trouble with them because they're like, you're selling it too cheap, But anyway, so that was MagniPrint. And, it also had all your basic stuff, like it could print out your programs with the inverse characters and all the other stuff, by using graphics, which was a very important tool back in those days. There was a number of competitors for that, but we were out there, one of the first. Probably one of our biggest sellers, another big seller, this was a hardware-software combination, was something called the Parrot. I don't know if you guys heard of that or...
I'm aware of the Parrot. I've always been aware of the Parrot. I don't have one in my collection. I've never seen one on eBay. They're hard to find.
Anyway, so Parrot was a nice little program. A good friend of mine who actually worked at BF Goodrich with me, a guy named Ed. His name, I forget his name at the moment, but anyway, he had written an article in the magazine. He had figured out how to digitize sound, basically. He had come up with a little thing that you basically just fed it into the cartridge port, not the cartridge port, but the joystick port. And as you know, the joystick had 15 positions, or 16 positions, really, because it was 4 bits. And
Stewart?
Yeah, Ed Stewart. That's his name.
Talk is cheap. Yeah.
Yes, talk is cheap. So he had come out with this article. I was good friends with him at the time, and I remember talking to him and saying, like, wow, that's a great thing. I wonder if we could turn this into a commercial product, And he's like, sure, I'd be all in. I'd give him a royalty. And around that same time, I went to a user group meeting, and another guy I knew was there, and he had already turned his Atari keyboard. He had sampled in stuff using the Talk is Cheap. He built the hardware himself, and he had sampled in some sounds, really the song of the Addams Family. And he'd have like do-do-do-do, and he played at different, so instead of just sampling sounds and playing them back, he had it where your lower levels of keys on your keyboard was tones. So each one represented, you could basically take in a single tone and turn it into a whole keyboard worth of tones, just by raising the pitch and lowering the pitch. And then he had special effects on the upper keys, so he'd have all the different sound effects. And he played that, and I was just blown away. That was like awesome. So I went into partnership with him too, and I said, I'll give you the royalty on this. But, of course, we had to turn it into a real product. So we had like a sound wave editor. It was only 4-bit sound, but amazingly, you got about the sound of like, let's call it a cheap AM radio, So you could play like actual songs on it. But what was really great, because, you didn't have much memory in this machine. So what was really great was doing stuff like what I was talking about there, where you turn in your keyboard into a music keyboard, and you can play whole songs that way, instead of like, I believe you get on an average disc, in memory, you could get about like maybe 45 seconds of a real song, a whole orchestra if you wanted it, because it didn't really matter. It was always funny, by the way, showing Parrot at the Atari shows around town and all over, because you'd be showing it there, and the majority of people, I'd say maybe 3/4, would come up and just go, "Oh my God, your Atari is playing that sound? I can't believe it," because they're used to the beeps and blips that the games came out with. And they were absolutely floored and, maybe bought a Parrot and, and were very, very impressed. And a certain percentage of people would come by and go like, "I can't believe that's total crap. That sounds worse than my AM radio." And I'm like, well, you understand, though, that a computer is generating this. This is all digitized. You could manipulate this. I can speed it up. I can slow it down. You can play it on my keyboard. They were like, "I don't get it. I don't get it at all." So we had that mixed bag on that. But Parrot was a very fun program.
And both accurate, really.
yeah, that's true. So that was an interesting thing, And when I had this company, then, like I say, I did it as a hobby. So I'd go to the Atari shows, and I'd have a girl or two work at the booth there, selling all my stuff, and I'd just go around the show, playing with everything else, and enjoying myself. And it was really great company to have in that respect. It took, I got to do all the fun stuff, and I hired a girl to do all the not fun stuff, like fill orders and take calls and things like that. I had to do support and stuff like that. And that was one of the things I learned very early on, was even though I had manuals for all this stuff, that was in the days when software actually came with manuals, and you needed them too. I will say that, because some of this stuff, as you could believe, there wasn't a great UI. UI design was very primitive at that stage. So you really did need the manuals a lot. And I remember, if I got a single phone call asking me a question like, "How do you do this?" That would be in the next copy of the manual that we'd send out. So I kept very low volumes. I printed in low volumes, even though it was more expensive to do that way, of manuals and things, so that I could update them frequently. So that basically, sometimes we'd just do an insert sheet if I did have a bunch of them in stock already. So we're very quick about that to avoid calls, because we really wanted this stuff to work when you got it, and you didn't have to call me and ask me a question on how to use it. What was frequently the case was that there'd be something already in there, but it might be, on page 40 of the manual. And so I ended up, doing a lot with, here's where to find the different things. I had an index in the book already, but, I improved it and things like that to avoid those kinds of questions, So.
Sure. So what was your bestseller across everything?
Well, amazingly, really one of the best sellers profitability wise. So one of the things that happened was I came out with this one product called Scanalyzer. And what this thing did, I wrote it for my own purposes. I don't know if you did much programming in those days. Did you do much programming on the 8-bit? Okay.
Just in BASIC.
Well,
yeah.
If you did in BASIC, one of the things you probably found yourself in at one point was you're writing a program, and let's say you saved it to disk periodically. So you've got your disk drive there, and you saved it to disk, and all of a sudden you ran the program and you crashed your computer. One of the things that was sad and amazing was that frequently you'd try to reload your game from the disk that was in there at the time, particularly if this program wrote to the disk, for example, then your odds were even much greater that now your program can no longer be read. There was now, you basically, when your machine crashed, it wrecked the sector and your whole program was destroyed. And if you knew about BASIC at the time, BASIC was a tokenized language, which meant that really you couldn't just go and read the other sectors and make any heads or tails out of it. So what I did was, when this happened to me, I said, I wonder if I could detokenize. So it was in tokenized form, which is a common expression back in those days. So when you'd list out your program, it would basically, if you said save, it would save it in this tokenized form, which is a very compressed format, where different variables would have just a single, character representing them and things like this, and depending if they were string type or integer type. And so what I did was I wrote a detokenizer first. That detokenizer could go and read these programs. And this even worked if they wiped out the variable table, so they could do various protection techniques on these. There were programs that were actually sold, commercial programs that were sold as BASIC, games and other stuff. And so what I had figured out fairly early was, if you detokenize it, if you do a really good job, that was the key. You had to do a virtually perfect job of it. In other words, put the $sign in front of the string variable names and things like this to recreate that program in such a point that you could then say run, and it would not only run, but you could now edit it and change the program. So I'd already done that. And then I figured out, well, if there's a bad sector in there, what I'll do is I'll read up to that point. I'll skip that bad sector, try to read the next sector, particularly if it was the next sector that was already defined in where the file is laid out, so you could see where the sectors fell. They usually were in order, but not always. And then start reading from there. And the trick was that you had to read a bunch of times to find out where the tokenization really could begin there. So in other words, because it's all binary, you really had no idea, am I looking at code or not? But if you started decoding from that point, you could decode so far, and then you'd find out it completely crapped out. In other words, that path didn't work. And you might have to go through 100 iterations before you found the ones that actually would play out. So now you're on the right starting byte to detokenize again. And from there, you could actually work backwards then, too. So basically, you'd wind up with, you could recover your entire program that you had lost. In some of my cases, these programs were like, dozens of pages long. These were big, beefy programs. You recover the whole thing except for a few lines, typically, that were on the sector that got wiped out. And so I came out with that. I also I put my disassembler in there that was actually written with me and another guy who also worked at Goodrich at the time, Guy Albertelli. So he contributed to that disassembler. And the disassembler, too, by the way, would beep and tell you when it hit a direct sector write, for example, or direct sector read, so that it could help you find, it basically showed you where the protection was in software as well. So not only could you take a piece of commercial software, either that was written in assembler or that was written in BASIC, a BASIC program, you could always detokenize and get it running again, so that now you could edit it, change it to do what you want, make copies of it, for example, or whatever. And an assembler program, you can now at least not only see the assembler code that makes it up, but it would warn you, it would show you where it's trying to direct read a sector. So, for example, if you wanted to try to work around that, if you read my book, you know about some of the techniques that even if you try to change that to a no-op, for example. So here's a direct sector read, and they're going to check if it's a bad sector or not, or if it has a certain CRC code, various things that you could do to make a sector that would be unique to that disk, essentially, that would be hard to copy. And the sophistication grew. It was a cat and mouse game between the software pirates and the others, and the sophistication grew over time. But essentially, if you went into the code, you could change it. But then they'd later put checksums in, for example. So now you'd have to, it still would break later in the code, and you'd have to go find where they put in that checksum that was checking that group of code. So if you changed one instruction in there, you broke the program again in a different place. And, of course, you could do layers of that and all that. So I remember cracking a lot of programs and, just for fun of it, and finding that kind of technique, more sophisticated techniques. And, of course, I wrote about those in my book. And then years later, we came out with a program called Chipmunk. And you're probably not familiar with that. That was not a real big seller or anything, but it was a great program. What it basically did was it allowed you to back up really thousands of programs with no programming knowledge at all, no skill. It basically removed the protection from the program for you automatically. So basically, there'd be a index with all the different program names, and then a letter that you type in, and that would tell it essentially what to look for and what to change in it. That was actually written by a friend of mine, and I marketed it for him. So, yeah, I didn't write Chipmunk myself. Yeah. In a lot of these cases, I, at a minimum, wrote the documentation. I wrote the ad copy and things like that.
I have a list of other products. I'm just going to run down it if you have anything to say about them or any memories or anything. Sure. And some of them we've already talked about. We talked about Scanalyzer and Parrot. Impersonator, sort of touched on. Yeah,
that's the cartridge copier. So that's the one that basically you'd put in the cartridge port and it would allow you to copy cartridges.
Cassette operating system.
So that's one. I had kind of mentioned that briefly when I was talking about the cassette section of the book. And cassette operating system was actually a pretty nice program. A lot of people had cassette drives and did things with them. And so some of the things this thing let you do was not only copy cassettes, which was, of course, very popular to do, and they had protection techniques on those, too. They'd have these what they call multi-part cassettes, so that part one would then command the computer. The program would read in from part one. And it would then tell the computer, like, skip ahead so much and then start reading again and check out what was on that other part, for example, and do various tricks like that to protect the cassettes from being copied. So even cassettes had copy protection. As you can imagine, piracy was a pretty big problem back then. I always felt if you can't beat them, join them. So I was always like neutral towards piracy. I knew people would pirate my stuff, but that was one thing I was lucky, although I paid a price for it, and I'll tell you about that real quick here. I'll segue for a second here and say that I used, as you can imagine, since I wrote the books, I felt it was my obligation to have the best copy protection techniques because I'm writing the book on the subject. I'm going to give away my secrets potentially in the book, but I still felt obligated that I better make my stuff really, really damn hard to copy so that, I don't look like I don't even, what is my qualifications to write the book if I can't protect this from even an advanced software pirate, So I always came out with some really great protection. And some of the stuff I did was, for example, instead of tokenizing like a program, I tended to write use BASIC for the UI and for a lot of that stuff, and then write assembler routines for the critical pieces. So as you can imagine, Parrot, for example, had a ton of assembler in it, and so did other programs, for speed or for doing things that would be hard to do in BASIC, and things like that. But one of the things I did was, besides just tokenizing, I basically compiled my BASIC programs, which made it very, very hard. Even the guy who wrote Chipmunk said, I can't figure out what you were doing in your code. I know you're checking. I can see that you're checking for this sector, maybe an unstable sector or something like this. And yet I cannot change your code to prevent that. And part of that was because, as you can imagine, a digitized version of that program, is now out there. So it's no longer basic code anymore. It's now this other language to make it run faster and be smaller and stuff like that. It's basically turned into like an assembler type thing, but it's not a human readable assembler is what it really amounted to. And the only sad part about that, so that was great in the day that I now had this reputation that I could protect things that even though I did tell how to do that in my books, I talk about unstable sectoring. That was probably one of the most sophisticated protection techniques I came out with, and I basically discovered this myself and started using it myself and then gave away the secret in the book later, was that you could create a partial sector. So you had to have a disk that was completely random orientation. So that meant that most of them came out that way if you didn't format them. So most of them already had, if you read the same sector twice, you get random results. Not always though. So if they didn't, you'd have to use magnets to really randomize it by moving them around, powerful magnets, and you could then create basically an unstable sector there. But the trick was, if all you did was create an unstable sector, that was my first protection technique, and somebody had then written me and told me, I forget if they wrote or called my support line or what, but they had figured out a way to copy an unstable sector. And I was like, this is before my book came out, and I was surprised by that. I go, how did you do it? He goes, believe it or not, it's as simple as I took a piece of tape to the disk. I ran it out the machine, out of the drive, and then I'd sit there and wiggle it while it was writing that sector. And in other words, when you went to run the program, so it wasn't unstable, but he created it unstable. He heard when it got to that bad sector, you know how it made that little sound when it got there, and then he'd wiggle the disk, and that wiggling process created the bad sector, or created the unstable sector. So I very quickly said, I got to refine my technique. And so within, I think about a day or two, I figured out that I could partially format a sector. So now I could read the first half of the sector as stable data, but the second half of the sector would be unstable. So now if you sat there and wiggled it when you heard that noise, it would no longer work, because now the first half went unstable as well. And I'd check it like 3 times to make sure that, and that prevented even the wiggle technique from creating that thing. And so that's how I created an unstable sector. And that was really one of the most powerful protection techniques ever on the 8-bit Ataris. Don't know that anybody cracked that before I finally came out and said how I did it in my book, And even then, people couldn't necessarily create that circumstance themselves, So,
Sure.
But anyway, so back to the cassette operating system. That was a fun little program and did some good stuff. It was not a big seller. We had a number of very small sellers. One, my friend Ed Stewart, who wrote that Talk is Cheap, he had a couple of little programs, one called Dots, one called Letterman, that we sold through our catalog. We had some other catalog items. We occasionally advertised them in magazines as well, but they weren't big sellers. We had something called Bulls and Bears, which was a stock market analysis program, not a seller. I mean, that was one that we basically probably sold about 5 copies of in all of history, So we had some real small sellers, but we had some massive ones too. By the way, just to go back to Parrot for a second, you said you never even saw the hardware. What the hardware was very interesting. So I was looking at it and I go, I want to come out with this thing for like $29, but I don't want to spend $25 on the hardware. How can I do that? And I was at a Atari store, and they had this whole crate of paddle controllers. And basically I said, how much for the whole crate? And they go, basically it came out to about $1.50 each for those paddle controllers. And there were 2 paddles on each controller. So that became, if you bought Parrot, the first edition, Parrot was a analog. So it basically had a potentiometer in there. And the paddle controller already was a potentiometer. That's how the paddle controller worked. And so that worked on the Atari 800s and 400s fantastic. And I had a little sound input. I put a couple transistors in there. I paid a guy, I believe, like $2 or $3 to assemble them for me, and basically had my hardware for Parrot. So basically, you recorded in from a tape recorder or your voice or whatever you wanted, your sounds, and you could then digitize them and put them in. I gave you code so that you could put in your own basic programs, for example. So now you could have your program, like if you recall Ghostbusters, where it'd play the music and then you'd hit the space bar and it would say Ghostbusters. You could do that. This was before that came out. I was probably one of the first to have a commercial product to digitize. So you had all that stuff. So that was pretty nice. And so it essentially was a paddle controller. Now, once the 600 XL and some of the other XL computers came out, they actually broke the paddle controllers. If you had an old paddle game and tried to play it on one of those, it would not work. The paddle controller was very sporadic. It did not work hardly at all. What had happened was, internally, to save money, instead of using a true D to A converter, they read the paddle more in a digital, or they still read the joystick 15 positions, but the paddle controller used to be a voltage between 0 and 5 volts. And basically that was just completely terrible now. So I remember I first tried the Parrot. I got a new computer, the 800 XL came out, I believe it was. And I plug it in and I'm like, this doesn't work. Oh my God, I got to update my software. So what I did was I changed it. Instead of giving the voltage back, I actually had to put my own little D to A chip, a digital to analog converter in there, or an analog to digital in this case. And that still was only about $1 or $2, so, cheap enough. But it did make the production, I had to raise the price a little bit of the Parrot so that it would work now on any of them. And it's sent in now through the joystick, essentially joystick controls. So I changed the controls from being an analog to a digital,
Very cool.
Yeah.
Keyboard customizer.
Okay, keyboard customizer was more of a programmer utility. It was not too exciting, never really a big seller, but it was an early program that I actually kind of wrote for myself, and then another guy took it and really extended it and did all kinds of stuff where essentially it let you take a single key and turn it into programming macros and various things like that. So it was a kind of nice little program, but one of the problems with a lot of that is you don't really see them. Would have no value in this day and age. That was one of the sad things about a lot of the Alpha System stuff was that as opposed to a game which is still 100% playable today, these utilities and these sound things and everything don't have a big. They're not as exciting today. Oh, by the way, that is the thing that I didn't mention. The downside of my protection was that later on, I wish that more people had been able to pirate my stuff, because today, not all of my software is available. If you go to these boards and things, some of my software either was just never cracked or never made it out there. And when I went to try to recover some of it with a buddy of mine who had the cable that would let you run it to a PC, let's say, some of the discs were bad, and I wasn't able to actually recover some of it either. So, so some of it is lost to the history of time,
Looking at Atari Mania, there's, the big list of your software, and for many of them, it's just, nope, don't have it.
Yeah, it's sad. I wish I made it more piratable. Really, or at
So
least that, shortly after the Atari lifespan, which, by the way, if you're in the Atari thing, you may know that lifespan went on through the late 90s because
sure.
of other countries. So even though I had shut down and sold all my inventory at some point along the way, we were actually still getting, like conversations and things from a vendor who was selling that stuff overseas. So that stuff kept selling for many, many years. So very
Awesome.
interesting. Yeah.
All right, so tangent, since you brought it up to the disks and the source code, and did you recover any source code, and do you still have the disks that you weren't able to recover?
Yes.
Because
Yeah,
my nerds can do more than your nerd. I'm sure.
Well, I'd be happy to give you anything and everything, of what I have in those discs. And if you guys could recover some, I'd be overjoyed, I mean,
Excellent.
I don't know how many people, if anybody, would be interested in running some of these programs because, like I say, they may not have a lot of utility in this day and age other than for historical completeness or something. Now,
Sure.
certainly I have all the source code for all of them. And so, the source code would be potentially of interest to somebody, potentially, I can't really say.
Absolutely, and people love to, people still play with their Atari machines.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who are totally into historical completeness, absolutely, but also, looking at old source code and seeing how it worked and learning from it.
Yeah.
Because people are still writing programs today. I mean, mostly games, but
Yeah.
So yeah, anything that you want to share, would love to.
I'd be happy to.
out
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, I know you're out in California, so
Portland,
we'll
actually,
work
but-
something out. Yeah.
Great. Okay, you had a program called Cheat for cheating on games.
Yes, that's true. So what happened was, and later I did a really amazing thing for the ST, but that's a different podcast, I assume. But on the 8-bit, this program called Cheat, what it would do is it would go into a tremendous list of games that were out there at the time, and basically through various techniques, be able to give you unlimited lives, be able to give you, let you replay levels, without going back to the beginning, like, start from any level, play from any level, give you unlimited points, unlimited, So it basically was like the cheat utilities of much, much later, but really one of the first, I believe, to do that, to basically, this was especially great on some of these games that were long, big, drawn-out games. But if you died 3 times, you never got to see that final scene, for example.
Right.
And that was a great little utility for that. And for a lot of people, it made it way more fun. For other people, it might ruin the game. So but this was you bought it, and if that's the thing you want to try to get past this game and just learn, and might be something like a lot of the games had it where if you kept living all through the game, you'd get to like the 10th level, let's say, and this level would be almost impossible. But yet it took you an hour of play to get there. So now if you died on that level, it really pissed you off, and you'd go through and a cheat utility was very, very nice for that, as you can imagine, to be able to jump right to that level and play that level and master.
Sure. Did you make a game called Spacewalker?
Yes, I did. So I had a game called Spacewalker, and what happened in that was basically a chicken crossing the road game, or whatever you want to call it, a Frogger, Prepper, Preppy, if you remember that. And basically, this game worked a little differently. Its mechanics were different, where you'd be down at the bottom of the screen, and cars would be coming, and the faster you went across, the more levels you went through, the faster and faster it got. And then as you started, if you got hit a few times, all of a sudden the cars would be going, or spaceships. I forget if they were cars or spaceships that I had in there. And then, there's spaceships. That's right. So spaceships were flying all around and hitting you. And if you made it past a lot, eventually robots would come out, these giant robots that filled up like half the screen. And they would pretty much, unless you like ran down to the bottom or the top, they were going to get you. So they were very hard to avoid type of thing. And that was the Spacewalker. And that was, just a fun little game, based on some assembler code and some player missile graphics. It's one of the first things I wrote, really. And I had another thing called Maze Walker, which was a similar type of thing where it generated a maze and you'd race somebody, Maze Race, I believe it was called. And that was actually based on something else I had seen. Back in those days, there was a lot printed in magazines. And I would take that maybe as a base and then change it into a different game based on, use some of the same logic or other things, So had a lot of fun writing those games.
Excellent. Basic Turbocharger.
Yeah, Basic Turbocharger was basically a set of like utilities and other stuff that were assembler routines that you could easily incorporate into your basic programs. So, you can imagine this as like smooth scrolling up and down as opposed to right and left. You know how in basic language you could get a player missile graphic to move left to right, but you could not make it move up to down without writing a bunch of assembler code to make it do that. So this included all kinds of routines like that, to do things like play sounds, to do things like, make your missile graphics move in any direction, do printer utilities, do all kinds of other stuff that basically required assembler. In other words, that was beyond the scope of what BASIC could do. And so Basic Turbocharger was a disk and a booklet came with it, too, telling you how to incorporate those. It came with sample programs and things like that. It was a nice little package that we came out with that wasn't a big seller particularly. As you can imagine, it's really just to programmers who are interested, but was a really fun thing to create and a fun thing to have, for programmers.
Yeah. And you published a book called Your Atari Comes Alive by Richard Leinecker.
Yes. Yeah, that was a book, as you say, by Richard Leinecker, and that was a similar collection of things, but that was where you might have some assemblers or to have some software, but that let you build all kinds of hardware. That was basically an instruction book on how to build like your own sound digitizer, your own thing that turned on the lamp, something that lets you control your Christmas lights. You can imagine you could do some pretty amazing stuff with that. So this guy was a hardware tinkerer. He came out with a lot of really cool stuff. I met him at, I think, a computer show, and he, was showing off some of his stuff, and he created this book. So it was great. That one also was not a big seller, but another fun product.
Nice. All right, just a couple left, and I think we're getting into the deep cuts now.
All right.
Graphic Transformer.
Yes, this was a nice one. So this one really did a amazing job, really spectacular into this day and age. Like I took a picture of myself with this, let's just call it a 320 by 180 or whatever the resolution was, and a print shop icon was like 20 by 20 or something like that. And so what you'd want to do is you'd want to put your face in a print shop icon so you could print out a card to somebody and have your face on it and be recognizable. Well, amazingly, I could probably find some old cards printed this way. This thing would let you do that in stages. So what it did was it showed you like 5 or 10 different reduced. This is just one of the things that it did. It could take any kind of format in like KoalaPad or graphics packs or other things. Take any kind of format in and convert it to any other format. So first of all, so you could even take strip poker images. If you remember the game Strip Poker that came out, this let you capture those images, pull them off the disk, read them in, and write them back out in a different way, print them, do what you wanted with them. So, but one of its really greatest features was it would lower down the resolution in stages and you'd pick the one that you felt best represented it. And what was amazing about it was you could take these full-blown images pretty much from a game. You could let you capture stuff from another program. So you could take any of these images and really shrink it down, into like a print shop icon or another type for other programs, and make it look amazingly good and totally recognizable. Like people could look at my print shop icon and go, wow, that's amazing. How did you do that? So it was a really fun program. Once again, some of these are not the big sellers,
Right. That was written by a guy named Jeff Bader.
Yes, he also wrote MagniPrint. So he's the guy who wrote MagniPrint, and later we came out with MagniPrint II and then MagniPrint II Plus. We kept adding stuff to it. He was basically a engineer, and this was just a hobby for him. Basically, all the programs in there, except for the ones by me, were written, and a couple things like by Ed Stewart, a couple guys who were programmers at Goodrich, but almost all of it was from hobbyists, people who just loved writing stuff. Some were kids. Parrot was written by a 15-year-old kid, who I happen to have met at a user group meeting. Yeah. So, one of the things living in Cleveland here, we had at our Cleveland Museum of Natural History, we had a giant Atari group. And I started going to that, when it really got big. This would be in a huge auditorium, and there'd be like 100 people in there. So it was really something. Back in the day, Ataris were very popular,
Yes, indeed. Master Crunch.
I can't remember what that is.
Shrink down your programs to save disk space and memory. We'll compress a basic program.
Yeah, that one was contributed to us. I probably ran an ad or two. It was in our catalog. We probably sold a handful of copies of that ever. So that was not a big one,
Sure.
But it was a fun one.
And finally, a Schematic Designer by George Polly.
Yeah, so George Polly was a super smart guy. He did a ton of work for us later on the ST line. So he actually wrote one of our biggest sellers on the ST line called Digisound. But back to Schematic Designer, he was a guy who built all these schematics. He built hardware. He was a hardware tinkerer. And he had a need for this. And he wrote his own thing to lay out the circuit boards. So this was basically a circuit board design program. It did not simulate it. That was the one thing I talked to him about. It would have been awesome if it would have then simulated the circuit running, in the computer, So basically run a simulation or, of the circuit. But it did not have that capability. It just really lets you lay it out, print it out, so that you could use it had all the standard notation for like a little light and a resistor and a transistor and all those type of things. And it gave you some great little tools to hook them up. So that's how that did.
Awesome. So then you went and did some ST products, and as you said, that's for a different podcast. But what was on the ST side? What was the big one?
I would say the big guys there were, I didn't look up some of those things, but we had PowerPrint, which was really the successor to MagniPrint. It had the same type of abilities to print out giant posters and do other things, but really was a more powerful program and did a lot of additional things in it. We had Digisound there. Now, that was an 8-bit synthesizer, much higher speed too. On the Atari 8-bit, I forget what it was, but this was at like 44 kilohertz, on the ST. That was powerful enough to really get some great sound. And in there we had, that didn't have like a good reader port for it. So, and this, by the way, Digisound was used, when I actually did the software for them too. So one of the things that was really a major breakthrough on the ST, just to talk real briefly, was that the ST, unlike the 8-bit Atari, where you basically could create that digitized sound playing back by lowering and raising the volume, the ST had 3 chips, and each of them was really just a tone generator. So you weren't able to digitize sound in the same way. So through a lot of painstaking work on an oscilloscope and a few other things, we were able to do it and play back and actually get a tremendous quality of sound, for 8-bit sound, full bit 8-bit and high speed, and play that back. And so, for example, I had done the sound for Chessmaster 2000 and things like that. So that, when it says pawn takes bishop, that was all my coding to do that. And that was really one of our biggest. We had, of course, I have to continue the 8-bit line. So I had protection techniques for the ST. The ST was a different world for protection. It really, because it had a disk drive that can do almost anything right out of the box, as opposed to the Atari disk drive, which had its own microprocessor in it. So it was really limited in what it can do. On the ST, you could do more stuff, which meant that you could create some good protection, but you also could recreate that with your standard hardware. So some pretty good copy programs came out. I came out with one. Other people did, that could pretty much recreate just about anything you could possibly do without any specialized hardware or anything else. So the copy protection scene was different there. And one of the sad things about that was that meant that some programs were protected with what we call manual protection. That's where it asks you, turn to page 16 of the manual and type in the third word in the fourth paragraph or something like that. That is so incredibly painful. All of my stuff had a secret thing where you could click on an invisible button. That, of course, had the mouse and keyboard and everything. So, it could have things like invisible buttons on the thing, and then you'd type something in and, it'd let you right through the protection. And later on, I remember I regretted that I had used that technique in some of my programs. And not long after, I started including a little thing, hey, to bypass this, just do this. So if you bought a later copy of some of my stuff, I regretted doing it because it made it painful for people to run some of our software. There we had a thing called Instaboot, and really one of our super popular products was called Switchback. Switchback was a little hardware software device that was really amazing on the ST. So what would happen is you could be running a game, let's say, and you'd hit this button, and it would capture the entire image, not just of all the, because, keep in mind, each chip had its own custom controller, so you'd have to capture the state of all the different chips that were there. By the way, when we first did it, one of the first things we figured out was, by the way, when you did it, the clock also set back. ST had a clock in it, and it would also set back your clock. So I had to say, no, don't set back the clock. They don't care about that. But, make it so that basically you could save a game at any point. So this let you, and instantly restore to it too, by the way. You could keep up to 4 banks if you had an ST4, let's say, or depending on how big the game was. You could keep multiple banks of saved games, for example, and instantly come back to right where you left off. So right in the middle of a level, let's say you hadn't died yet and you were about to, and you could hit this button. It would save off that state instantly, and then you could continue playing. And the Instaboot was a thing where, and the ST, there was all kinds of programs that people would load up at start time to do things like give them drop-down menu things, so that you had a little calculator and various things like this. And it ended up taking a long time to boot your machine. So this used the same technology that we created that was for Switchback, but basically instead just to make it boot up instantly, open whatever files were open, put you back into the exact state that you left off in if you wanted it to, or just bring you up to your initialized state, after everything is loaded. So instead of having your 5-minute load, which somebody like me actually had, this thing would load you up in about, let's say a minute, or less, because you still had to read all the stuff off the disk,
So tell me about the end of the company. How and when did it end?
So what happened was it was slowing down. And I had decided that around that time, this is getting into, let's call it the early 90s. So by the, you can imagine I started this in 80. You got about a 10-year good run out of the 8-bit stuff. And then the 8-bit and even the ST stuff by the early 90s was trailing off. We were still selling stuff. We were still advertising and doing a few things, but not a ton of business. The business was trailing off. And really had a choice. Could I single-handedly save the Atari 8-bit or ST? I didn't think so. So I said, why don't I move into the IBM market? And I decided, ill-advisedly, to say this time, instead of using all these amateurs who I have to help and do all this stuff, why don't I just have professional programmers who I work with at that time I was working at Progressive Insurance and for my full-time job. And why don't I have them create these programs? And I dish out the different programs, and there really were some unmet needs there. I was not going against Lotus 1-2-3 at the time. That hadn't even come out yet, but I would be going for the developer market, which was huge on there. Like I remember hearing like Dr. Dobbs' journal. The number of, they were selling like 100,000 copies every month. So I figured if I could tap into even a small percent of that, and by the way, the advertising would be way cheaper there too. So I committed a bunch of money to say, if we can come out with a suite of products, I wanted to have like 5 or 6 products to launch the company. And all the guys went to work. And basically what I found was that professional programmers didn't really get it. They were not good. They were more used to, well, show me in the manual where it says how to do all this. And I go, well, of course, if this was in the manual, nobody would pay you $29.95 for the program, And I just found that they really didn't have like the creativity that the hobbyists and the enthusiasts who work. There were people who worked at companies, as professional programmers who also were enthusiasts. And I found that really it was the enthusiast market. And when that happened, I said to myself, well, I've got a couple lines of products. It's starting to slow down a bit, but it really doesn't cost me anything to continue selling these, And at the time, my girlfriend really did all the bookkeeping. We had no full-time employees or anything else. We were shipping out maybe a few dozen things a month. And I was approached by a big distributor who basically said, we want to buy you out. I forget how it all came about, but essentially I got a very sweet deal because, at that point we had inventories of products. He actually wanted us to print out more stuff too, so we did. We actually gave him a big supply of the stuff, and we agreed that if needed, we could, create more stuff as well. But he essentially bought us out, and he kept going for many years thereafter, And I'd still get calls because keep in mind, even though I sold out the thing, so I'd refer people to him, amazingly, in 1995 or something, I get a call from some guy in Brazil going, I'm looking at your ad here, and it's like an ad from an analog magazine from 1982, and he called the number, and, we still had that number, the sport line,
Nice.
So, yeah.
If I had to guess, I would guess you sold out to B&C Computer Visions.
I think it was them. Yeah, probably was them. And
Bruce over there, yeah.
So, yeah. We had a lot of dealings with a couple of the big distributors. We were not a distributor-friendly company for a couple of reasons. We kept fairly low prices comparatively, so we still gave reasonable margins, but some of the stuff was harder for them to sell than others. And, we weren't real great. If somebody said, I want to buy 50 of these, and it was like, as you can imagine, like Parrot, it'd be like, oh, it'll take us like 3 months to fill that order, so, or something like that. I mean, Parrot, I think, was not a good example of that. But, one of the things that we did have was a big distributor in England who bought a ton of stuff. I mean, that guy, I don't know where all he was selling it around the world, I believe, but he actually sold as much as some of the distributors in the U.S. were selling of our stuff. So, we sold a lot, though, direct and doing shows and things like that. These old Atari shows were really fun,
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you do today?
Well, today I am what's called an enterprise architect, which is a fancy title for somebody who is kind of overseeing the development of Progressive Insurance. So, I look over various projects and plans and systems. I still love to program. So that was one thing, that's why I can be at a very high level, but still get down in the code myself on occasion. That's something I'm not really supposed to do as an architect, to go in there and go, I know how to fix this. I'm going to help you do it and make it better, and things like this. But, we basically look at it from an architectural perspective. And I do other things too there. So I do that. I also do consulting on the side on a number of things. I've done giant websites for companies. I've done other stuff. So I'm still very active in the computer field. I still love doing it. And still my favorite thing to actually get a programming assignment where I work. Unfortunately, I'm a very good programmer. So I'm like really excited. I got this great programming job. I end up completing it in a few hours. And I'm like, oh, man, it's over, So, it's like I would love to just be a programmer again, a pure programmer. But, in my role, I'm needed in other places. So,
yeah. You still have an Atari?
I still have an Atari. I still have STs, still have many Ataris. Let me say it like that. They're not all hooked up at any particular point in time, but I still have many Ataris. I still have lots of ST line computers as well as other old computers of various types and various consoles. Nice. Yeah. I'm still a collector. I was always interested in this backup technology. So, as cartridges came out for various consoles and things like that, I was always first in line to figure out ways to back those up and, have like a little zip disk that let me run all my Nintendo 64 games in and things like that. So some fun stuff.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So what haven't I asked you about the Atari days that I should have?
I don't know. I really covered some of the stuff, like some of the giant user groups that we used to have back then. These shows were definitely amazing. You could go to the shows and there'd be 8-bit and ST stuff both there. We get to play Maze Runner against a bunch of people. I don't know if you remember that game, or Maze Race. I forget what it was, where basically you'd be a big smiley face on the ST.
Yeah,
and it'd
MIDI Maze.
The MIDI portion. Yeah, MIDI. Yeah, that was a great game. And so, I just love going to those shows. So I'd travel all around the country doing these shows. We'd bring stuff and we'd sell stuff there. I'd always have a booth and things too, But it was really a great time, So,
nice.
Yeah.
Was there ever a product that you wanted to create that you had hopes to release and then never got out there in the world?
There were a lot of things like that. Where, games that I wanted to create, I'd see something and I'd go, boy, I could really do something way better than this, things like that. And so there were a number of things like that, a number of hardware projects, too, that I really wanted to do for both the ST and the 8-bit that, were, let's just say they wouldn't be economical. The market would be too small for them. It'd be a niche market, but it'd be a fun market,
Can you give an example of what?
Well, we did actually end up doing some of that stuff, like voice synthesizer and, things that would take in various inputs. So you could have all these different inputs and basically control, turn your Atari into a home control, unit, for example, to control your whole house and things like that are some examples of things like that. So, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I look fondly back on those days,
Sounds like it. If you could send a message to the Atari computer users that still exist, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Well, I want to thank all of you for being loyal Atari people for so long through all the turmoil of the various shakeups around, I believe it was 84, where you couldn't even buy a computer for a short time there, and other things when Jack Tramiel brought the company and other things that kind of messed you up, but still the loyal Atari base, it's been there for a long time and it's still there. So I'd like to encourage you all to keep going and doing the great work that you're doing. particularly I am amazed at what they've done. At the time we had a couple of things like Rembrandt, I believe it was called, or Rembrandt, that,
Rembrandt, yeah.
really took the color palette and took it beyond what it could be. In other words, not so much that it was the number of simultaneous colors on the screen, and things like that. Did some amazing stuff. I've seen some stuff on the Atari 8-bits that I cannot believe. And, it's just amazing that they're able to do that. Somebody created a website that actually ran off an 8-bit Atari. Of course, they had to have some hardware help with that and things like that. And I'm also amazed by all the other add-on hardware that there is. So I'm really excited by some of that. Of course, I love the emulator scene as well. So I'm very big in the emulators for, the 8-bit has pretty much been conquered as far as they have some near perfect emulators,
They do. Yes, especially on Windows. On the Mac side of things, and I'm a Mac user, we're currently in a kind of dearth of good emulators. They haven't kept up with the times, with the new operating system changes.
Yeah.
So it's a dry point right now, but I think
what's kind of amazing
temporary.
is on my Android phone, I have a virtually perfect emulator on it, and I can have a little controller and play the games, play BC Quest for Tires and Monty and all the old classic 8-bit games, and really play them on a phone, which is pretty amazing, considering what it took back in the day to run that stuff. So very happy with that. I still love those old games.
I think I have what I need. Thank you, George.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute, make a tax-deductible contribution to the Internet Archive, a nonprofit digital library that has done incredible things to preserve computer history. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate. Thanks.